So today I'm going to show you guys a very basic intro to acrylic paint. Now if you've used watercolor before, this is kind of a step up from watercolor. So what you need first thing is you need paints, and you can see I've already put some down, but then you're also going to need a palette. So here I'm using a disposable palette that's kind of like wax paper. It's really nice to use these sometimes if you're not doing a project for a very long period of time, or you're using very minimal colors, because then at the end of it you can just take this and throw it away. But when you're doing that, it's important then that you only take how much paint you're going to use during that time period when you're painting, because obviously there's no way of saving these. Now you could also still use actual palettes like you would in watercolor. You can use a plastic plate and put the paints on there, and then rather than washing these paints off to save them so you can use them the next day, you can just take plastic wrap or even just a plastic bag, wrap plastic wrap around it or put it into a plastic bag so the air doesn't get in, and that way you can go back to your paints the following day. With acrylic paints, they typically only last a couple days, but depends on how well you wrap them up. Next thing you're going to need is a cup of water, as always, and then you're also going to need paper towels. I next have an assortment of brushes. Unlike with watercolor, now you want to get brushes that still have soft bristles, but you want a little bit more firmness. So watercolor brushes are very, very soft and almost kind of like they won't have this firmness. You don't want to use a watercolor, like a brush specifically for watercolor with acrylic, or else you could ruin the brush. And then you also have palette knives. Palette knives come in an assortment of sizes. What these are used for is to actually mix your colors. You don't want to get in the habit of always mixing your colors with a brush. Little bits, it's okay, but if you're mixing a lot of a color, you don't want to do it with a brush, because what's going to happen is when you're taking the paints and you're kind of mixing them around, you're going to get a bunch of different colors that kind of get stuck right in here. So even though here at the tip of the brush, you're going to have the color that you want. So for example, let's say you're making orange, and you have orange over here, but then randomly as you're painting, you're going to have some areas here that have just pure yellow or pure red. So as you're painting, that might just accidentally come through, and then you didn't want that. With a palette knife, you will always just kind of use this to mix the color, which I'll show you, and that way you don't ruin your brushes. To clean these off, because you can use this for multiple different colors, just grab your paper towel, wipe them off like that, and you can use this over and over again. Other thing is, while you're painting with acrylic, with watercolor, you could be painting, right? You can put your brush down, you can keep it, you don't want to usually keep your brush in the cup of water for watercolor, because the brush is going to absorb a lot of water, which will then ruin your painting if you didn't want it to involve a lot of water. With acrylic though, if you've used your brush and it has paint on it, and you don't need it for a second because you're using a different brush for a different color, you need to put this brush into a cup of water. If you don't, the acrylic on the brush is going to harden, and then if you go back to use it, it's just going to be a really hard brush that you can't use again. So when you're not using a specific brush, always keep it in a cup of water, and don't keep the cup of water all the way filled, obviously. So then, as I mentioned, you do want to use different brushes for different colors. So you could have like a light brush for all your light colors, a dark brush for all your dark colors, and I always recommend having at least one brush that's dry in case you want to do some blending techniques. So let's start with making colors. So let's say I wanted to make orange, okay? So we know orange is made with yellow and red. Now what's important when you're mixing colors, you have an area where you place the paints. You don't want to mix right here. You want to keep an area where the pure paints are that you squeeze out of the bottle. So if I want to make orange, I'm going to take some colors and put them over here. And what I'm going to start with is the lighter color. You always want to start with a lighter color. And the reason you want to do that is because the darker color is going to dominate. So if I took red and put a big chunk right here and then added a little bit of yellow, that red is always going to dominate. So instead I'm going to start with the lighter color. Now between red and blue, it's a little different, but blue is definitely still darker. So here I'm starting with my yellow. Now you can wipe this palette knife off right now, but I'm not going to, because I'm just going to, rather than taking right from the middle of the paint, I'm just going to take it a little bit of red, just a little bit, because I can always go back and get more, and place it here. And then I'm just going to kind of start going back and forth until I've made the color I want. And the reason you want to go back and forth is to make sure that all the paint that you are creating is evenly distributed. And actually, this is a pretty good orange. I don't think I even need to get back any more red. And now that is my orange. So let's say, okay, perfect. In my painting, I'm going to have an area that's going to have orange, but I'm also going to have an area which is going to have a lighter version of this. So then what I'm going to do, I don't want to take white and just put it in here because then that's going to ruin my regular orange. So instead, maybe I'm going to take a little bit of this orange I made, put it over here. And now, because now I'm taking a much lighter color, I do want to wipe off my palette knife. Because if I just put this in the white, I'm going to ruin the white. And white is the color that you always kind of want to keep pretty clean. So I'm going to wipe off my palette knife, grab just a little bit of white, start mixing in here. Now, how much paint you actually make, it just depends on what you're making. So if I were to make, if I knew then what I plan to paint today was going to involve a lot of orange, I'd probably make more than this because it's really tough to then go back and make the exact color you want. But some people, what they will do is like in their sketchbook write down how much they use of certain colors to mix. But you can see now I've made an orange, I made a light orange, but I haven't ruined any of these colors. So now I'll just show you how to make a range of other colors following the similar technique. So now that you know how to mix a range of acrylic paints on a palette, now I'm going to show you some different techniques that you can use when you're actually painting on canvas. This is canvas paper, which is really nice. It's very thin. It's great for practicing, but then you can also obviously paint on big canvas panels, stretch panels. Biggest thing with acrylic to keep in mind is that it dries very, very fast once it hits the canvas. On the palette, it will stay wet for a while, right, while you're working. At the end of the day, when you're done, you can wrap it up. That's when I said you can save the paint for later on or toss it if you don't have much paint left. But once you start painting, acrylic is going to dry very fast. So if you have a specific area where you're just going to paint one color, that's okay. But if you have an area where you want to fade from one color to another, you need to work relatively fast. So you really have to be able to, you have to plan what you're going to do before you start and not kind of figure it out as you go. So I'm going to just this is just an abstract form, but I'm just going to show you different techniques on here. So let's say if you start, we're going to fade from a dark blue into a lighter blue, and then maybe we'll finish off with even a lighter blue over there. If you look at the brushes I have, you have to think about the brushes for what you are painting. So this brush doesn't make much sense for doing this large of an area, but this brush could be really useful for when I get to these little areas down here, okay? Similar with this brush must be a little too big. I can pretty much only use it here, but if I try using it here, I'm probably going to go outside the lines. So it probably won't be very useful for that. This brush would be pretty good, because you can see it has more, I can still get into these little small areas. I could use a lot to fill in these big areas. So this one we're going to keep on standby. And I kind of like to actually hold my brushes between my fingers, kind of like Edward Scissorhands, but it's nice because I'm always have them available. But as soon as they have paint on them and I'm not using them, remember, they go right in the cup of water, okay, so they don't harden. There's also angled brushes like this. Angled brushes are really nice because then you can use the edge of that brush to kind of hug the edge of whatever form that you are painting. And that allows you to have these really nice, clean lines. So this will definitely be a very useful brush. And I think we're actually going to start with this one as well. So first thing, you can always just start with the pure color. But if when you use that color, it feels like it's not going on the canvas very smoothly, then that means you need to take a little bit of water. And you're not going to do it like with watercolor. You're not going to just take the water and put it on the palette. You can just barely dip your brush in some water, and that'll help smooth the paint around. And you'll be able to see, because you'll feel if the paint's moving very smoothly or not. If it feels like it's kind of like rough and it's not really covering up much of the canvas, that means you need a little bit of water. Like right here when I'm trying to go to the edge and it's just kind of fuzzy, that means this paint is a little too thick. So I'm just going to dip my brush in a little bit of water, kind of brush it against the edge of the cup. And you can see now it's starting to really move, and that's barely any water. So you can mix it on the palette. Sometimes it's just a little harder. Or if you took too much, again, that's where your paper towel comes in. Just kind of brush off a little bit of the excess water on your paper towel. But it's very important that you only take however much paint on your brush that you would think you need for a specific area. Because if you take on too much paint, and people do this very often, you'll take too much paint on your brush, and you're painting a relatively small area, so then what happens is you feel like you need to use all that paint on your brush, but there's nowhere for it to go. And then you end up having all these just really kind of clumpy areas of paint. So if that happens, just brush off the extra paint either on your palette or on a paper towel. And the other thing with acrylic is you can do more than one layer. So if this first layer you have all these brush strokes, that's okay. Don't feel like you need to make sure you have this perfect blending of brush strokes right away. I always think that the first layer with acrylic is to get the main shape. So see how I'm trying to get the edges? That's what you always want your first layer to be. Now, depending on what you're painting and depending on the kind of paint you're using, you can always paint it so it has very smooth texture right away. But if it doesn't, don't worry about it. You can see this top area is pretty much already dry. So now I'll go back, grab some more paint, and do another layer. Okay, so now if I want to keep using this brush for a different color, you can wash it off and dip it and grab a different color. But what I actually want to do, because I want to have this fade into a light blue. I could make a light blue and paint it right here, but I also want to show you a trick of what you can do to then kind of take this paint that's still wet right here and blend it into a white, or blend it into white paint to create light blue. So first I'm going to wash my brush off since it has just pure blue on it. And this technique is a way that you can kind of create a color magically on the canvas itself. So I have some white on my brush, and I'm going to go around where I painted. Now this only works if both the colors are still wet. So if one's dried, it's not going to work as well. So I'll just do this top section for right now. I have a little bit of white. I'm actually going to grab this brush now and dip it into my blue paint. You can see that now the blue and the white are starting to blend together. And if I don't like how that's looking right there, I go back with my white brush. And this is where having multiple brushes is really important, because you have to go pretty quickly. So if you only use one brush, by the time you wash one off, go back, use another one, your paint's going to dry. And you can see this area right here is already dry a little. So I have to grab now new blue paint. Go back with the white. And when you're mixing like this with white, it'll be, after some time, your white brush is going to have like the color that you're fading. So mine is already having some blue on it. So you may need to wash it out. But you have to be patient. because you both have to work fast, but also know that sometimes it'll take multiple layers to achieve exactly what you want. So now that I've just shown you how some basic of how to paint a color, fade if you want to another color, and then I went back and added some white here. It's important to know that even though a canvas is white, whenever you're adding white paint to a canvas, it's going to look different because there's so many different types of white paint, and the white paint is going to be a little shinier than the actual canvas. So if you ever make a mistake somewhere where you didn't want to, like you accidentally got paint on there, try your best, grab a paper towel with some water, try to wash it off, try to get it off as much as you can, because the idea of people think, oh, well, I'll just take white paint and paint over it, it'll be very noticeable. It looks kind of like white out. It really stands out, like it was clearly a mistake that you tried to paint over. So if you do get any paint on an area where you didn't want to get any paint at all, try your best, grab a really clean brush, clean water, paper towel, try to just wash it off as best you can. Okay, so now I'm done using these brushes for right now, so I'm just going to stick them in the cup of water until they're ready to clean. And now I'm going to do a really just kind of clean outline outside this object. So when you're doing an outline, this is where water is important because you really want your paint to be able to move along when you're creating the outline. So I'm going to show you actually on this canvas. I'm going to paint this real quick on the palette. So I'm going to dip my brush into some water first. And then I'm going to take some of this blue paint because I'm just going to do a blue outline. I'm going to bring it over here. And then this is what you can do to create a really nice point on your brush. So if you're trying to create an outline. So you kind of whirl your brush in the paint first to make sure all sides are coated, and then you going to twist the paintbrush and slightly pull, and it's going to create a nice little point on your brush. So you're just going to roll the paintbrush, pull, and what you can do if you're ever like you're really new at painting and you want to do some tests, you can actually do some test paints on this palette. It's another reason I really like these disposable palettes because it gives you a lot of space just to experiment, and since you can try a new one or you grab a new one every time you paint, you get a lot more areas to experiment. Okay, and then I can kind of see how it feels. It feels like it needs a little bit more water. And knowing kind of when paint needs water and doesn't with acrylic, it's kind of experience. You'll kind of just know because the paint doesn't really feel right. Because the paint, you always want it to move like this. It should move really smoothly. So if it's kind of moving but like kind of getting stuck sometimes, just like a little bit, that means you probably need a little bit more water. So twist, pull, and now, and I will have to go back and get more paint, but, so now I'm going to just gently go around and fix the outline. And whenever you're outlining something in paint, you're always going to come from the inside, so not the outside. You can paint from the outside sometimes, but typically I found that it's much easier when you're going from the inside, because then that's an area that's already has usually the color you're using, so it's easier for you to blend. You don't need to always do an outline, but I'm just showing you a different way of using a smaller brush. You can see I'm just doing these really short brush strokes. So don't try just to right away kind of do the whole thing. And you can see I have my pinky finger down on the canvas. So my pinky finger is keeping my hand stable, but the rest of my hand is elevated above the canvas so that my brush is straight up and down. So pretty much when you're using these really thin brushes to try to create an outline, it's almost like you're drawing. You really want to go lightly, take your time, right? And you're just using the tip of the brush. So even though this brush is really long, I'm not pressing down. I'll show you on the palette. I'm not pressing down and then dragging in. Because do you see how thick that is? And you can do that if that's the effect you want. But if you really want just a very thin line, grab some water, then you have to use the tip of the brush so you can create that nice thin line. Right? As soon as you press down, you're going to get that thick one. So that's, but to hold my pan like this, it's really tough. That's where I kind of put my hand, have my pinky down, and kind of as a stabilizer. Or you can put your whole hand down, but then the problem is then your whole hand's at an angle and then your brush is at an angle. So I just put my pinky down and kind of keep my, it's kind of just in front of my pinky, and then keep the rest of my hand up. So my brush is kind of above it. Okay. So I recommend making sure you experiment making some colors, and then just experiment creating some kind of a form, just so you have different, different ways of applying and fading acrylic paint and using different brushes.